welcome to our seminar. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping at the start, so we're all on the same page about how this webinar will run. Welcome. It's the third one in our series now, which is the Anthropological Responses to COVID-19 series. We have two RAI staff with us today. That's moi, Hani, and we have Emma as well.
Hi, everybody.
So the way our event is timed today is that first Patrick, Heady, and Barbara Pieta will give their presentation, which will be followed by 15 minutes Q&A about that presentation. And then we will hear Dr. Margaret Bullen give her presentation, which will also be followed by 15 minutes Q&A. And after that, we will have about 20 minutes of a general Q&A with all the speakers on stage. And if you have a question to a specific speaker, please write the name of the speaker at the front of the question so we know who to ask it to. Otherwise, we'll assume it's a general question. You can ask an anonymous question next to the submit button. If you go to the Q&A, you can submit questions. Next to it, you can make a hook for send anonymously, so that's possible. You can also upvote questions, and we'd really like to ask you to make use of that. This way we know which questions are most burning in our audience, and we don't have too many double questions. So if you have a similar question of one that's already been asked, just upvote the one that's already been asked, and then it will pop up higher in the list, and we are more likely to answer it. But we will not be able to answer all questions today, most likely. Just that you also know this, the content of this event is recorded today. So if you don't want your name mentioned at any point at all, then please send in your question anonymously, because otherwise we might say your name with your question. Let me see, I think that should be everything from my side. If you at the end still have burning questions at the very end that you need to get out, you can send them to me at info@therai.org.uk and I can distribute them to the speakers. Okay, that's all from me now. I'm going to hand over to David Shankland, who will chair our webinar.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everybody from London. London is today, I think, probably only at a 20th of its normal usage capacity. So it's a rather strange feeling being in the streets and coming to an empty building. But at least there is some life, and so we can hope that things will get better soon. Our COVID-19 seminars, which have been extremely popular, and thank you for your many messages about them, carry on today. And for our first two speakers, we welcome researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. That really wonderful, location, nest, which has been nurturing anthropologists now for nearly 3 decades and has really made a transformative impact on the European scene. So anyway, we're very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Heady and Ms. Pieta to give their presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
So the PowerPoint presentation we prepared for the webinar in July was too long, and we were not able to deliver it in the time available. So we are grateful to the RAI for this opportunity to present the full argument. Now we have taken the opportunity to cut out some repetition and also to add references, but we have not updated the content of the slides to take account of developments in the 3 months that have passed since the webinar. Viewers may like to consider how far the analysis that follows has been borne out by events since then. Our presentation is about kinship and community structure and how it has affected the spread of COVID-19. So we have called our presentation Strong Families and Infection. I am Barbara Pieta, and my co-author is Patrick Heady. We have worked together at the Kinship Network Research at Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle. We both have done field work in North Italy. When preparing this presentation, Patrick was responsible for developing and presentation of the model, as well as some interpretation of all quantitative data. My job was to interpret and present and analyze all qualitative data, including all Italian material. In terms of introduction, a couple of points. So this presentation will be about how kinship and community structures may have helped to shape the spread of COVID in Western Europe, focusing particularly on Italy in the first few months of this year. It is also a presentation about methods, about how comparative statistics, network research, and ethnography can be combined to help explain the development of the COVID epidemic. But we also want to say what this presentation is not. It's not a set of hard and fast conclusions, even we do present a definite model. But we think that doing this sharpens up discussion. Everything in the model and in the evidence we cite is open to argument. Ours is not an expert account of European or Italian epidemiology or society. It's also not an ethnography of Bergamo, even though we do say quite a bit about that. So this is in terms of introduction, and I will now pass to Patrick to present the model.
Thank you, Barbara. Comparative research in the last 2 decades has transformed our understanding of the geographical distribution of European family systems. In terms of a distinction defined by Rea in 1998, there is now broad agreement that parents and adult children are more likely to share the same dwelling and to help and to interact with close relatives in other households in the so-called strong family systems of Mediterranean Europe and Eastern Europe than they are in the weak family systems of the Northwest. There is also evidence that family systems in rural areas are stronger in this sense than those in large cities. Next slide, please. One reason we think this could be relevant to COVID is that family systems and the community systems to which they are linked affect who spends time with who, and that, particularly the amount of time in close proximity indoors, affects the likelihood of infection. In other words, family systems matter because they affect the social organization of space. We now present, without any prior justification, a model relating family systems, spatial organization, and the probabilities of infection. Next slide, please. Okay, in the first row of this slide, we look at the relation between family system type and the spatial organization of kinship and social relationships. So in strong family systems, intergenerational co-residence, that's multi-generational households, tend to be approved and to be quite common. Kinship networks tend to be locally focused on local communities, and so do social interactions generally. In weak family systems, the opposite is true. Intergenerational co-residence is disapproved of or rare. Kinship networks are free, ignore community boundaries to a large extent, and social interactions generally also relatively indifferent to local boundaries. These are our hypotheses. On the second row, we come to our hypotheses about the effects of this on transmission rates. And this is that in strong family systems, infection between generations is likely to be fast, whereas in weak family systems, it's likely to be slower. In strong family systems, infection within communities is likely to be fast. In weak family systems, it's likely to be slower. On the other hand, in strong family systems, infection between communities, transfer between communities of the virus, is likely to be comparatively slow, whereas in weak family systems, it's likely to be fast. Next slide, please. We now take each part of this model in turn and justify it with the background data. And having done that, we will assess its effect on transmission and mortality using the other data that we have to hand. Next slide, please. Okay, so we start by looking at intergenerational co-residence and transmission to the elderly. Okay, there seems to be a general process by which the virus is usually transmitted from place to place by mobile younger adults, but less mobile older adults fall seriously ill. So in the early stages of the epidemic, mortality would have been highest in those places where young adults were most exposed to external sources of infection, and where also infection was most easily transmitted from younger to older members of the community. The impact of intergenerational co-residence on this process would be that when older generation parents share their home with adult children, whether these children are married or not, this makes it very easy for one generation to infect the other. So multi-generational households provide a perfect environment for the second stage of the infection process. If external infection rates between young people are similar, mortality will reflect the second stage of the transmission process. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll now look at some statistical evidence. This is data taken from a large-scale comparative social survey of the living circumstances of elderly adults aged 50 or over in Western Europe. The survey concern was called SHARE, and the point at issue is whether or not these elderly adults are living with adult children. In the left of the graph, we have two green countries, that's Denmark and Sweden, and we see that the proportion of elderly adults living with adult children is very low, it's below 10%. It's about twice as high in the next yellow block of countries, which are Austria, Netherlands, Germany, France, and highest of all in Southern Europe and Mediterranean countries, Spain, Italy, and Greece, where it reaches about 40% of all elderly adults are living with adult children. Next slide, please. We now look at the impact of the excess mortality caused by COVID during the first stage of the pandemic in Europe. That's until the first phase of lockdowns. And these are data produced at the end of May, recorded at the end of May in the Financial Times. Essentially, we see a very similar pattern. Denmark, again, has the lowest rate of excess mortality, and Italy and Spain have the highest rate of excess mortality, more than 3 times as high. The other countries are spread around. Next slide, please. So just summarizing these points again and drawing some conclusions. So co-residence rates and overall mortality, except for countries that didn't lock down, such as Sweden, total mortality levels mainly reflect infection patterns from January to March. Although other north-south differences within Western Europe could also have played a role, the similarity between the distributions of the two figures indicates that the role of co-residence in spreading the transmission of the virus to elderly people may well have been a deciding factor. An implication of this, if true, would be that apart from exceptions like Sweden and Britain, these results suggest that the different mortality levels in Western Europe owe more to residential and social differences than to differences in the skill with which medical and political establishments tackled the virus. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we now go on and look at the next part of the model to do with the connection between family strength and spatial relationships, spatial clustering of kinship and of other social relationships. So in making the case for this part of the model, we're going to focus particularly on the CAS project, on kinship and social security, which collected data on the spatial structure of kinship networks and helping relationships within them. Next slide, please. Okay, this project, which was coordinated by the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, but involved distinguished collaborators from 8 different countries, was carried out between 2005 and 2007 in 19 localities, 2 or 3 localities in each of 8 countries. Half of these localities were in countries in the Northwest, weak family countries, in Sweden, France, Germany and Austria, and half in strong family countries in the South and East, Italy, Croatia, Poland, and Russia. And I'm just going to check some notes so as I can read out a little bit more that you need to know about the descriptions. Okay, some key points is that the Cass studied kinship and marriage networks and behavior. And these were described from memory by samples of informed individuals. There were 30 of these network interviews per field site on average. And icons, and the icons in the graphs I'm about to show you represent average values for each field site. Green icons are for rural field sites, red icons for urban field sites, that's small areas, sort of a street or a few blocks of flats in a major conurbation, and yellow icons for a couple of field sites in smaller urban areas. Next slide, please. So here we go. Okay, figure 5 shows 2 graphs based on network data from the 19 Cass field sites that I've just described. Figure 5a shows that, taking Europe as a whole, the spatial concentration of relatives, roughly speaking the proportion of fairly close relatives who live in the same community, is highly correlated with co-residence between different adult generations. This confirms one of the assumptions made by the model shown in figure 1. It is also what we would expect, both the ways of bringing family members together so that they can help each other. Since the contacts involved in mutual assistance can also spread infection, we think that strong family systems will be associated with a high risk of infection between relatives, even when those relatives are not living in the same household. 2 other important points emerge from these 2 graphs. Figure 5b shows that spatial clustering of relatives is also highly correlated with local endogamous marriage. This too is what one would expect, at least in societies like most European societies, with bilateral kinship systems. Even in strong family countries, kinship ties do not receive a uniformly high emphasis. Looking at the colors of the icons in the panels of figure 5, we see that green icons are associated with particularly high values of all 3 kinship variables. This means that all over Europe, multi-generational households and locally endogamous marriages are likely to be most characteristic of rural areas, reaching particularly high levels in the rural areas of countries with strong family cultures. Next slide, please. We saw in figure 5 that all 3 kinship variables attain much higher levels in rural areas. A detailed check with the individual level data shows that they apply particularly to families who are involved in full or part-time peasant farming. The underlying reason for this is that even in the midst of a market economy, peasant farms and village communities relied heavily on informal, unpaid labor exchange. In the absence of legal sanctions, they also relied on emotional commitments to keep the labor exchange system on track. This made kinship ties a vital resource for practical economic organization. Next slide. Kinship was not the only form of social bonding that could be used in this way. Church attendance, ritual kinship, local festivals, drinking together in bars, working together in the fields were all used to build a sense of community. Marriage ties were part of this, and a preference for local endogamy was often combined with the preference for keeping personal ties of all kinds within the local community. So in those not very distant days, strong families were part of a social system that emphasized close social ties within the same local community. Our hypothesis is that strong families still are associated with a community-centered system of social interaction, most notably in rural areas, but to some extent in towns and cities as well. Next slide. And what would the consequences of this be for infection? This preference for local interaction would favor the transmission of infection within the same community, but reduce the risk of passing on the virus to people living outside of its boundaries. So once the virus had entered a particular community, repeated retransmissions between its residents could lead to a high level of local infection, which would only spread gradually to neighboring communities. If this process was combined with a high level of transmission to the elderly, it could lead to very high localized levels of mortality. So where have we got to now? In the next slide, we show our overall model again. We think that we've now provided some evidence for all of it, and we'll just leave it to you to look at for a minute or two before Barbara then takes us on and looks at the Italian data that we're going to use to investigate, to verify or test this model.
Okay, so thank you, Patrick. So I will now move to the next part of the presentation. I will use qualitative data from Italy as well as data on geographic distribution of excess mortality to show how our model works in practice. So at this point, it is crucial to highlight that the model discussed just now, which considers kinship and community structure, does not explain everything that has happened in Italy between February and May 2020. Other factors seem to account better for the whole Italian case. This map demonstrates a very uneven distribution of mortality rates across the whole country. Some regions have registered very high number of deaths, for example, North Italy, especially the center, so Lombardy. And some other regions, for example, the south, have remained relatively unaffected. Now, we argue that this variance cannot be explained by kinship and community structure. Rather, other factors might have been at play. And these are connections with international trade, very different for different regions. Differences in transport networks, differences in healthcare systems. So the regions are health authorities. So each region manages its public system differently. There was also different timing of the disease outbreak in different regions. This all might have played a role in difference in COVID mortality in Italy. And further to this point, this map shows a very sharp difference between mortality rates in especially two regions, Lombardy, which is here, I cannot see the cursor now, and then Veneto. So this is Lombardy and this is Veneto. And you can see very strong differences in mortality rates. And we agree with other commentators that it might have been rather the difference in healthcare system that best explains regional differences here. In other words, if you want to understand the difference between north-south and different regions, don't look at kinship structures, look at other factors. However, and this is what mainly our argument is about, we suggest that kinship and community system may explain differences at the level of the municipalities within the Lombardy. Our next figure is a set of 4 maps, and they all show cumulative excess mortality rates in biweekly intervals. On this map, you see an initial scatter of deadly cases. And what is initially surprising in this map, that the highest mortality is not in Milan, which is the economic center of the region, but in the north-south band, just east of the city. And this includes provincial cities, small towns, rural areas. Now, what is now important is in the next map, 2 weeks later, this pattern spreads, but not in a scattered way. Had it spread in a scattered way, you would see a lot of yellow areas marked in yellow, marking the medium mortality rates. Instead, what happens is you see the concentration of deaths, a very specific one. So red areas become even more red, and the areas that were previously marked in green become immediately red too. Now, we argue that such a spread suggests accumulation of reinfections in the communities, which means that once the virus gets into the community, it spreads within this community, but moves much more slowly to the neighboring ones. This is probably because social life in these places is in major part community focused, which is typical for the strong family systems in the South and Eastern Europe. Now, the mortality pattern would be different in weak family systems in the North and West of Europe, where social life is less community focused and more boundary free. Now, I will now use some qualitative data that we have to hand to illustrate the point about community-focused life and its association with high mortality rates in the North Italy. I will use the examples from the 3 valleys of Bergamo, as well as from the province of Brescia. We will look at Orzinuovi and Montichiari. We will briefly talk also about the case of, or I will use some materials from the famous Codogna and the city of Vo, which is a different region, Veneto, while the others are in Lombardy. As already mentioned, we will evaluate model using sources to hand, international and Italian press, and our field notes and recollections from the field. Patrick has done his fieldwork in the Carnian village, mountain valley in Friuli, looking at solidarity and social structure, and I looked at kinship and elder care practices in a small town in Veneto. I will also talk about some issues that our model does not account for, but which nevertheless may be explained, at least in part, by the local strong family systems. Now, this is the photo of Val Seriana, one of the valleys behind Bergamo. It's a maximum mortality area. So 5 times more people have died in the period between February and March this year, like so five times more than in the previous year in the same period averaged. So we think that the 2 citations from local journalists that we will now bring suggest that social life in the towns of this valley may be indeed community focused. Now, as we know, so like I will now read the Anna Bonalume herself from Bergamo, and she writes about the towns in the valley like this. The small towns that make up these valleys have strong rural communities that maintain their traditions at parish level, but can feel closed in on themselves. Everyone knows everyone else. Many elderly people still speak the dialect, and even teenagers stick close to home. And another journalist, quoting a woman from another town in the local area, writes like this: in these small towns, everybody knows everybody. In the bar, you always meet someone to have coffee with, and the baker keeps the bread aside for you because he knows that before lunch, you will come to pick it up. The family-like daily life is what we miss the most now. Today, you have your shopping delivered to your home and you watch the mass on YouTube. Now, as we already noted, community-focused social life is sustained by several social institutions. Among these are participation in local festivities and fairs, going to church, going to bars. These activities were also common in our field sites in Northeast Italy. Now, bars and agricultural fairs have been reported by the press as sites of the first contagion. Adriano Trevisan, pictured here, who was the first Italian deadly victim of COVID, was reported to contract the virus in a local bar in which he frequented every day. Similarly, agricultural fairs, and that also means going to the bar after the fair, were reported as sites where elderly from Orzinuovi got infected. Pictured here, one of the local fairs. Now, Orzinuovi was one of the hardest hit towns in the province of Brescia between March and May 2020. Also, chief medical expert from the hospital in Milan, Massimo Gali, believes that the spread is more likely to have accelerated thanks to the social gatherings in small clusters in the valleys around Bergamo. In the interview for The Guardian, he said, "We know COVID-19 is particularly efficient at transmitting within family groups. In osterias, local taverns, crowded with elderly people, it would have found a perfect environment." Thus, it is also not surprising that in phase 2, some local authorities recommended to introduce preventive measures for playing cards and watching football in bars. Now, another issue that our model has not accounted for, but which nevertheless we think is somewhat relevant to strong family systems, is long-term facilities and the situation during COVID pandemic there. So as in other parts of Europe, a high proportion of deaths in Italy were in nursing homes. Nursing homes are a separate issue everywhere. However, in strong family systems, kinship networks are likely to interact closely with formal services to provide elder care. My ethnographic data from Veneto confirms this. You have a lot of kin visits there. You have like kin coming to bring the residents to medical checkups in the hospital. Also, a lot of local volunteers supported the work and functioning of nursing homes. So it is likely that kin visits might have been an additional factor behind the disease outbreak in elder care facilities in Bergamo area. I will now quote an interview with the manager in one of the local nursing homes in one of the hardest hit towns. And she says what follows. I don't know how the virus got into our care home. Our local community is very involved in the working of our facility, and until now, nobody knows how the infection arrived. In Nembro, the town, we have very strong sense of community, and our residents were not closed in the home. We were often going out with their family members to participate in family gatherings. They were often going out with their family members to participate in family gatherings or do medical checkups in the hospital. Now, our aim in this qualitative discussion has been to test our initial hypothesis, which was that local communities might have played an important role in the virus spread at the beginning of the epidemic. For this reason, the last few slides have focused on places with particularly high mortality. The fact that local ties in these areas are strong supports our hypothesis. This should not be taken, however, to mean that areas like Bergamo are unusual in this respect. The social patterns in the places we have been discussing are consistent with what we have experienced in our field site locations. Again, Patrick has made his research in a mountain village in Friuli, and I did it in a town in Veneto. We think that they are probably general in northern Italy, and would like to pose similar they are likely to pose similar infection risks everywhere. But this is something that requires further investigation. However, the material presented in the last few slides does more than simply confirming our model. We think it also suggests that the model should be expanded so that it considers not only localization of social ties, but also the extent to which super spreader events like bars, fairs, churches, etc. are built into the local social relations. I will now head to Patrick for final conclusions.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, I'll start by looking at some conclusions for policy. Strong family societies are particularly vulnerable to COVID because of the impossibility of isolating the oldest generation, the strong social ties within local communities, and the tendency for rapid build-up of mortality in specific communities. But infection is comparatively slow to spread between communities. So policies that depend on isolating vulnerable individuals are unlikely to work in strong family societies. A focus on eradicating the virus and preventing the spread between communities may sound more radical, but is actually more realistic, and was the basic idea behind the Veneto model, the model applied in Veneto in the first part of this year. Is all this now just a matter of history? We fear not. Remember that we were writing in July. Other strong family societies in central and southern Italy and in Eastern Europe have so far been protected by geographic peripherality and prompt government measures. This may not last. There has been some criticism internationally and in the Italian press of the supposed ineffectiveness of the Italian response to COVID. We suspect the high mortality rates are mainly due to the objective difficulties arising from Italy's strong family, community-centered social system. Overall, the Italian response has been rapid, efficient, and imaginative. And again, the experience of Italy in the 3 months in the third quarter of this year back up the idea that Italy has been a pretty efficient place actually for handling COVID issues. Over to the next page, please. Conclusions for anthropologists. In general, we think we should have more confidence in the practical relevance of our own discipline. In its concern with kinship, local social interactions, and so forth. But we should also be more open to working with other disciplines and unfamiliar research techniques. About the model proposed here, both the justification and the evaluation presented here have been very impressionistic. Ideally, we should take our own advice and test the model with more network studies of family and social relationships, including direct evidence of their connections with actual infections. And that's the end of what we've got to say here. We have also provided some notes for people we see a next couple of slides, which people might like to consult. So if you just want to freeze frame things, you can look at this page, and now the next page, please. Similarly, and now the next page, where there's an abstract which summarizes our argument. If you would like to know any more about this project, you feel free to contact either of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a stimulating introduction to your research. And we move now to Dr. Bullen, who will talk about Basque balcony culture during confinement. So thank you so much.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to the Royal Anthropological Institute for organising this series of virtual seminars on anthropological contributions to the COVID crisis. Many thanks especially to David, Haneen and Emma for making this possible and for hosting us today. My name is Margaret Bullen, and though I trained in Bristol, Liverpool and Peru for the past 28 years, I've been living in Euskal Herria, or what's known as the Basque Country, a historical territory spanning the north of Spain and the southwest of France, tucked in the corner of the Bay of Biscay. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Here we go. Here we go. As what I've tried to do is bring pictures to inspire and hopefully capture your interest and captivate your attention as it's done for me. So here's just a slide to show you where I am. I'm speaking from Hondarribia, work in the University of the Basque Country, located in San Sebastian, and live nearby. So today I would like to share with you some observations as I look out and looked out from my balcony, observations from the balcony in both a physical and metaphorical sense, for indeed I am one of those lucky enough to have a house with a balcony and also a garden, something that became highly valued here during lockdown. And I've used the word confinement, although my brother corrected me and said confinement, we say lockdown in Britain, but in Spanish it's confinamiento, and I've decided to keep that word because it expresses to me the sense, as in the Oxford Dictionary definition, of keeping or restricting someone or something within certain limits of space, quantity or time. Or in the second case, which seems to really accurately apply to recent circumstances, of restraining or forbidding someone from leaving a place. So we were forbidden then from leaving our homes for anything other than key work, basic shopping or caring, while in the initial stages of what was called el estado de alarma, or the state of alarm, imposed from March 15th to June the 20th, although the strictest lockdown was actually gradually lifted in different areas, in different stages in different parts of Spain. So when I first came to the Basque Country in 1990, I was totally enamored by the Basque baserria, the Basque farmhouse, with these traditional balconies overflowing with vibrant red geraniums, standing out against the red or green paintwork of the wood and stone whitewashed farmhouses. These houses are indeed emblematic of Basque culture and have been used as a symbol to represent traditional rural society. Different anthropologists such as William Douglas or Joseba Zulaika talk about the way this ideal becomes a sort of timeless description of Basque culture. And yet it's clear that Basque culture isn't limited in any way to this, that it's much more diverse and dynamic. And so while they become the quintessence of this notion of culture, we must look indeed at 3 different areas when we're talking in terms of the geographical terrain of the Basque Country. We must think of the rural areas, of those represented by the sea, which is Itsasoa, the sea, the fishing villages, the old shipbuilding ports, and then where most of the population today live are in the urban centres. Of course, it's also has been a very industrial area, a very wealthy area, based on iron and steel before, and now much more on services. But as Teresa del Valle said in her study of Basque women, when they chose to take these 3 areas of the Basque Country, said, although there's this difference, we must look at what is in common. Surely there's a base of underlying cultural values and things that are shared across the territory of the Basque Country. So that's a little bit what I'm looking out for, is to see if we're looking at balconies as representative in some way of Basque culture. What is this Basque culture? Is there anything that's Basque about them? Or what other things are there in kind of universal terms that perhaps unite us in times of crisis, such as this present one? So it's my aim this afternoon to look at not a particular area as such, although my observation has been done from my balcony from this area in Gipuzkoa, but also largely through the internet and through a small survey that I sent out via WhatsApp with a colleague of mine, Josune Albizu, who collaborates with me on some of this research. So we found that during those 2 months of confinement in the Basque Country, balconies have been reinvented, and reinvention has become rather the buzzword of this confinement time. They provided an open space, a breath of air, a miniature garden for many. They're a place for sport, for exercise, for recreation, a place for studying, for playing with children. But also they become the stage for social contact, for communication, both for daily interaction, also for social comment and political process, and indeed for celebration. At the same time, the balconies are a viewpoint onto the outside world and a point of control and observation of other people, what other people are doing in their houses or in the street. And I put up this slide because on the 20th of June, the Basque government has approved a new ruling that says that any new building must now have at least 4 square meters of outside space in the form of balcony or terrace or garden. So recognizing the value of an outside space, how important it is in times when we might again be confined to our homes. So the first point that I wanted to make, the first use, which provokes really this whole study, is the study on the multiple uses and meanings of balconies during confinement in Spain and in the Basque Country. Rather than actually analyze the space, I wanted to think of the balcony in terms of its multiple uses and meanings. So first of all, in 4 things. First of all, for making a statement. Secondly, for cultural or artistic activity. Thirdly, for performance. And fourthly, for creating community. So I'll be pointing to different uses within those 4 items. So here, for making a statement, which I think is widely known nowadays, this is something that began in Italy, who entered lockdown before we did here in Spain. The idea of applauding health workers from people's balconies or windows if they didn't have a balcony. Something then that reached Spain soon after, as we went into lockdown just about a week later, and that spread like wildfire through the social network, which would be another topic of research in this time how things have moved through the social networks. So it's something that initially began the first day at 10 o'clock in the evening, but was brought forward to 8 o'clock in the evening so that the children could take part. So it was established as a routine, as a ritual for every day at 8 o'clock. People would go out onto their balconies and applaud for a minute or so the health workers. And then, as I'll come back to later, after that, it was then almost like a springboard for other performance, for music or other interaction. Even if people didn't have a balcony, they clapped from their windows, and the health workers received their thanks and in turn clapped back at them and sent out messages of thanks for that applause. Some people felt it wasn't appropriate to applaud because this was really, there was a lot of criticism of the government not providing sufficient or of having made cuts in the health service. But generally, there was this idea of applauding. But at the same time, sometimes there are also protests. In Spanish, it's called cacerolada, where people would go out with pots and pans and bang on them to protest for different things. So maybe to protest for cuts in health services, to protest against the government, at one time to protest against the King of Spain, who was in big trouble. And so this was another activity from the balconies. Also, when there was a day, there's many international days now for social and political protest. One of them was the Gay Pride, another day was the 1st of May for international workers. So there people were encouraged to decorate their balconies with, in this case, with the rainbow flag, in other cases with other emblems or symbols. Then so my second point then was with cultural or artistic activity, and there was many different campaigns to encourage culture as a way of keeping people active, both mentally and physically, something that was connected to school activity. And here the idea was that we are culture, we need culture. So there were all sorts of things for children. The rainbow became a symbol of resistance, something that children were encouraged to draw, to paint, and they then decorated their balconies with them. There were competitions, there were activities encouraged from school where the teachers put in an awful lot of work to try and keep children active, even when they couldn't go to school. And then there was a project, this particular project from one of the Basque schools was to encourage children to look at their balconies of their homes and then recreate them in different materials. Not just children played, but adults played too. And this was another social activity, was to play bingo. Bingo games were organized. Somebody would be the caller with a microphone from the balconies, and they put up the little sign there for the neighbors to see when it was gonna happen. And that was another activity. My third area then is the idea of performance from the balconies. So balconies having been a place to hang out your flags, to put out your banners, to mark your protest. So a place of display. For moving from that to being a stage where people would perform. So with things like, for example, the Aberri-Eguna, which is the Basque country's nationalist celebration day, which is always on Easter Sunday. Here we have the Lehendakari, so the leader of the Spanish government, hanging out his flag on his balcony on that day when they couldn't have other celebrations. Other fiestas, right now we're in mid-summer, which would normally be a time of great festive activity in the Basque country. And people aren't able, all the official fiestas have been cancelled, but people have, while we're in confinement, they kept them going from their balconies. So here we have a thing from a scene here from a family in Araba who are dressed up for San Prudencio, for the patron saint of Alaba. They've continued to dress up, so dressing up was also another part of the performance. Music, they would play the traditional music for that fiesta, and of course they would eat and drink, and by decorating and performing they would continue to do their fiestas. The one that's been big news just recently is of course the No San Fermines. It's been called in that way, No San Fermin, and so a San Fermin without the running of the bulls, without the thousands of people in the street or on the balconies, because the balconies in Pamplona become an economic venture where people actually rent and pay a lot of money to have a flat with a balcony to be able to watch the running of the bulls. Dancing, people would dance in times when there was marking a particular feast day or festival. It was also another activity, another performance, and another way to engage with people. So this is the final section, is my point on community. So by performing, the idea is to engage other people, to perform for one's neighbors, to entertain them, but also to establish contact and encourage communication. And this is something that in the traditional Basque society, the traditional neighborhood was called Auzoa, and there were very strong rules and norms for that social relationship. And as a hypothesis, I would think that this is something that carries on into the urban area of the Basque country, where even though you don't have the communication between caseríos, between the farmhouses, you have it between your neighbors, even from flats. So also eating and drinking is always a central part of activity, social activity in the Basque country, as in much of Spain. So rituals of, here for example, this is one on Sunday, having a drink before lunch is called el vermut, when people would meet, say, at 12 o'clock lunchtime with their neighbors from balcony to balcony and eat and drink together but apart. Or these older people who kept their ritual, their daily ritual, where they used to meet in the Centre for Senior Citizens. They meet across balconies and still have their little drink or time together. And community, another big event that was cancelled was the cup final between the two big Basque football teams, which were the Atlético de Bilbao and the Real Sociedad from Donosti San Sebastián. And so even though that event didn't happen, and it had been something that everybody had been looking forward to, had planned to go and invested a lot of money in their tickets, is something that didn't happen. So people came out onto the balcony, even so, to celebrate their team. So this was something, even when there weren't sports events, they happened from the balconies. And another major area and activity is, of course, music. And this, when the applause ended, after 8 o'clock, that minute or so of applause, in many areas, somebody would strike up music. Just here where I live, somebody over the way would play her accordion, a particularly Basque button accordion, Triquitrisha. She would play that every day. And then from the other side of the valley almost, a singer would reply, would sing a song then. And so there was this communication, as in the old days where people used to communicate across hills and valleys with there's like a Basque call that's called the Irintzi, but here people were playing with their musical instruments, whether a traditional Basque instrument, an accordion, or a pipe, or something more classical like this violin. And reading about this, a lot of interviews about people who decided to go out and play, and they feel that they offer this as something to the community, that they find that people's response encouraged them to keep going. Whereas sometimes people didn't like it, found that there was too much music, too much noise. Sometimes it wasn't just a song or two, sometimes there was a DJ and the whole neighborhood became a kind of disco festival. And so there's quite a few reports of people phoning the police and the police having to come and quieten down the neighborhood. So this idea of entertainment and singing together became something that wasn't always welcome. And this brings us to another issue in terms of the community. One of the problematic things going on was that sometimes people would, people would say, oh, they think they're the police. They think they can control everything. You know, they're looking out to see who's going out when they shouldn't go out, or who's taking too much noise. So then we see some signs like this one saying that we want neighbors, we don't want police. We don't want our police to be neighbors. But other times, as in this sign, it's saying, you know, please don't jump about too much. There's people doing exercise from their balconies and it's causing the whole house to reverberate and we can't get to sleep. So please stop jumping. And so there's this idea as well of creating community, of being able to talk to one's neighbors and not feeling alone, but at the same time the worry of interfering, no? So coming towards an end, there's one of the questions I pose myself is really whether the things that happened, the creativity, this reinvention, the performance, are these things going to carry on at all? Is the balcony a space that was only recuperated for that time, or is it going to be something that, as in this new decree, it's going to be something that's valued in the building of new dwellings? People have been remembered, the death itself, the death of the balcony, but also death from the balcony. People who died from the coronavirus were also honored. There's a particular Basque song, which is Awur Hauna, which was sang some days for the people who, because funerals weren't allowed, people couldn't honor their dead. So it also became a way of honoring the dead. And in this picture here, which drew my attention because it's a balcony that the plants have died, because in fact the inhabitants of that flat had actually died, and it was a journalist who noticed that. So does this imply that once we're out of confinement, the balcony in the Basque Country is going to disappear? Or are there certain things that have been recuperated and will continue? I'm not sure if am I all right for time just to share a couple of things, David?
Yeah, yes, you have a minute left.
Great, thank you. Well, just in that minute then, I just wanted to mention some of the things that people said to me in my little survey. And so they said, people who didn't have a balcony said, I sigh for a balcony or a terrace. People had said, it was a space I valued more than ever during confinement. It symbolically gave me a little sense of freedom, a feeling of being outside in the open air, but inside. A house without balconies could become a place of isolation, something like a prison. It was a way to have a foot in the outside world. The terrace gave us life. We've recuperated the balcony space. We've been able to channel the basic necessities of individuals and social beings thanks to the balcony. We've been able to breathe in the outside air, talk to our neighbors, and through music, relate to our surroundings, feel that we weren't alone. Many thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and beautiful timing, and a very, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. Could I just start by asking for two little bits of background information? in general, in this part of the world, what role does the balcony play? What did it play before COVID-19? Was it already a place of display where you would hang your favorite football flag, where you would perhaps raise a glass to your neighbors if you were drinking in the evening, where you would lean over, perhaps you would drop baskets over the side to pick up things from itinerant merchants? Did it already have a role in the life of the community?
Thank you, David. That's a really great question. I think it depended. It certainly did have a role in display, in people hanging out their flags and showing like political sympathies or football sympathies. Here in Ondarribias, we have a rowing team that's really important, which is green, so people tend to decorate with green. But in the old houses, it tended to be used more for hanging out the washing, for more practical things, not so much as a space for recreation. So I'm not sure about the baskets, but it was a space more for use, for people would have cupboards to put things in. Somebody said, oh, it was a space where we just used to put anything to get it out of the way, things that we didn't want to see in the house would push them out of the way. So in that sense, I think a lot of people have kind of rediscovered this space. And although it was somewhere that was for either getting rid of things or putting the washing out or using it for practical purposes, it wasn't so much for interaction or this kind of recreation.
I see. And a question that Joy Henry asks is related to that, when she says that, in essence, she's asking whether this was a renewal of social relations or was it new social relations? She says specifically, did you know all these neighbours before confinement?
Again, thanks, Joy. That's another great question. I think both. I think in some cases it was like reinforcing relationships that were already there. But a lot of people I talked to have said, it was a time where we actually, rather than just say hello, it was time where we spent time with our neighbours with this Sunday drink or after the evening applause. And so got to know people that you only just knew superficially before, or perhaps got to know them in a wider setting, because some of the houses here, some of the flats are constructed sort of around a patio area. So you were able to sort of enlarge that social relation. I think a case of both deepening, so more an in-depth knowing of your neighbours, and then a widening of knowing more people from there, from around you.
Yes. And thinking about community and conflict, Hannah's wondering about language. I mean, what language did one perform in?
That's in different, well, here it's, as you'll know, it's Basque speaking. So some things went on in Euskera, and that's not a point I went into, but it's an important one. That it was also one of the concerns during confinement time was that children who didn't have Basque speaking families but had Basque at school would lose out on that. So there was quite a lot of emphasis from schools in keeping them in touch with Basque songs. And so there were things going on in Basque. And in fact, one of the songs that is most sung is one called Choria Chori, which is the bird by a famous Basque folk singer called Mikel Labo. It's very simple, but everybody knows it. So that tended to be sung. But then there were also other songs, like one of the Spanish songs that was, it's a bit like the I'll Survive, the Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive. It was Resistiré, which became sort of like the national song at Spanish level of the confinement. And so different things. There was a mix, really. A mix, as is life here, is mixed both in the Basque and the Spanish language.
But there weren't any, I mean, is the community already segregated linguistically, and so they wouldn't be, this wouldn't cause greater conflict with some people shouting in Basque and some in Spanish?
I don't think it's actually a case of conflict. I think it's something that we live with, that a large number of people are bilingual. Nearly all children in this area learn Basque at school now, so people have a knowledge of it, and it's I wouldn't say it would be a point of conflict in that sense. Certainly that wasn't one of the things that has come up as being conflictive in relation to the balconies.
Right. Right. Well, that's interesting. And leading on from that, Mary Helen is interested about which comes first, as it were, the balcony activity or the community. In other words, do you have a strong community first, and then the balcony, or does the balcony help to recreate community?
Wow, that's a great question. I have to think about that one. I wonder. It's a real chicken and an egg one, isn't it? I think you need to have something like maybe the strong community isn't already there, because I see it emerged in some senses. But I think there's oh, what's the word? It's like an underlying social or cultural sense of community. So like here, I think people give a lot of importance to social networks. It's a bit like the family that Patrick and Barbara were talking about before, no? in the southern parts of Europe. So family and social relationships are really important. Mostly these, apart from the family, social relationships tend to go on outside of the house. People don't tend to meet within their houses. So they're very good at talking to other people in the street, relating to other people in the street, to partying together in the street, to all this other, all the idea of celebration, of festival, of singing together, of eating together. That's all very much part of this culture. So I think that in that sense, the balcony is kind of reinventing. We can't do all that. So how do we do it from our balconies? So I think, does that kind of answer, could that answer it?
Well, I think it's a beautiful answer. So the balcony becomes the new public space. Right. Yes. Yes. But we have a question here. Says, well, we mustn't forget the variegated nature of modern communities. And so for example, migrants or people in other ways didn't obviously fit into the dominant culture. So did they also become part of this balcony display? And was that perhaps a mechanism for helping them become better part of the community, or how did it work anyway?
That again, that's another really penetrating question, and one again that's not easy to answer. Here we're right on the border here, and just next door to where I live is Irún, and there's a network which is called Arrera Sarea, so it's like the network of reception or welcoming for mostly for migrants from different parts of Africa who are trying to get through to France. And now that all collapsed. It had to go into confinement as well. And the concern was that people would be arriving and wouldn't be able to move on, that they would be in the street, there would be nowhere for them to stay. And so the Red Cross and other places became important here. So in that sense, they were totally marginalized from this activity because they're really counted as homeless in that sense. So we got a lot of migrants, but who are on the move. And in fact, the permanent migrant population is much newer. There's a bigger Latin American population, and yet a lot of those people are almost invisible because there's a lot of women working, caring for people. So they would have been part of it with the people that they lived with, but so somebody caring for an older person would have continued to stay with them and would have participated in that. But it's something that really in my area is rather invisible, and I think that's a really important question because it's something that hasn't been evident here and has been more evident in its absence.
Yes. Well, that does help us think about it as a kind of almost a hegemonic kind of performance in a way. And thinking about the people setting up the discos, I mean, what they're perhaps doing is they're exploring the limits of how you can create impromptu rituals to create a community. Clearly you can do it with a few balconies, but you can't do it with 100, and then people start complaining.
That's right. Or you have to invent a ritual that everybody really wants to join in. And I think that's the issues with a lot with the music, and not everybody always wants to join in, do they? But the idea, I think the idea of reinventing ritual, that's something I'm actually looking out for in terms of here it tends to be very traditional society, and people obviously ritual is something that everybody likes to do in the same old way, and there's some areas of resistance not to change, and that's why I'm fascinated by seeing how quickly people did think up things to, okay, we can't do it this way, so let's think of a way to do it. So it seems that although we're reticent to change, people are actually, when put to the limit, when there isn't any other opportunity, they're really very good and very creative and imaginative about reinventing even the most traditional of rituals.
Yes, yes. I suppose we have to see the human actor being somebody that's always trying to recreate and actively engage with other human beings to create a kind of a meta level of communication. And they'll always be looking for those opportunities. And here was one. And they immediately went about doing it. But just so that we can understand a bit better, how strict was what you call the confinement in that area? I mean, was it were people really confined to their apartments for much of the day?
Yes, we had in the first month, I believe it was, 6 weeks, you were only allowed out if you were going to do basic shopping, and only one person from the household was allowed to go out and do that. If you had a dog, you were allowed just to go to the corner with them. If you needed to go and care for somebody who absolutely needed your care, or if you were one of the key workers, then you were allowed out, but otherwise you weren't allowed out. The schools all closed down. Like I was stopped by the police just here because I was walking my dog a little bit further than I was supposed to be, and you know, I apologized and they didn't fine me, but they were fining people. Wow. for you know, infringing. There were a lot of fines for infringing those rules.
And how long did that state of lockdown last?
I think it was 6 weeks, David. I'm terrible with numbers, but I think we were down for 6 weeks, and then we went through a series of phases. So when they began to open up, and there was a new set of rules about how you were allowed out in certain times of the day according to age group. So it began by allowing families with children to go out from between 10 o'clock in the morning till 7 in the evening. Adults were allowed to go out between 6 in the morning and 10 in the morning, and then again in the evening from 7 till 11. And older people were allowed out in the afternoon, senior citizens in the afternoon. So the idea was to try and separate people, and particularly allow the senior citizens to have a space of not interacting with other members of the public. So, but it changed so quickly. We had to keep having a new set of rules and learn very quickly what we could and what we couldn't do. And then, so I went through 3 phases. And the first, because also you weren't allowed to go beyond your local town, your municipality. And then unless it was for work, so you always had to have something that justified where you were traveling to. That was the last thing that to be freed up, was to be able to travel in the area beyond your immediate place of residence. And yet now we've gone a bit too far, and we're heading back. It looks like now we're heading back. There's been new outbreaks of the virus in certain areas near here, and just from midnight last night, the rule is that you have to wear a mask in any public places now. So people are being a bit slack about that, and that's a new ruling. So I'm not sure whether we're not going backwards.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. And our speaker from last week, Giovanna, has a question, and also comparing it with the material that she was talking about on Italy, and saying, well, clearly we need to understand the response to COVID-19 in this way as being creating new social relations, as well as simply causing damage, and often in very unpredictable ways.
I'm not sure if I quite heard that, David, sorry.
Well, it's a question about the new forms of social interaction which emerge in this kind of novel situation. So our speaker last week was talking about the way that certain education techniques were perhaps improved by virtue of the lockdown, and then when the lockdown finishes, they can be carried on and be used in schools, perhaps on a permanent basis. So it's trying to look at the positive aspect. Sounds a bit of an awkward way of putting it, but certainly things that we can build on when we go back to a new normal.
Yes, I think, I was thinking about both of the talks last week, made me think about some things. One would be that aspect of what survives, perhaps in my last slide, now, the death of the balcony, what survives beyond this, whether community relationships have been improved, whether that's something we can carry on. And another thing that I thought was from the other talk from Vanessa and Chiara about pregnancy and lockdown, one of the ideas from there that I meant to mention and forgot was the idea of the gaze. They said how important it had been to one of the pregnant women they'd spoken to, was that she didn't feel she was totally enjoying or experiencing her pregnancy because she didn't have the social gaze on her, because she wasn't out and people looking at her and she being able to feel reflected in their gaze her pregnancy. And I was thinking about how important that is. No, it's like, if we're thinking about the balcony as display, as the balcony as performance, it's also that people, we need not just the communication in the sense of talking and, hey, how are you, and not feeling lonely, but the kind of that mirror, no, of reflecting back on ourselves when we become totally social beings by other people acknowledging us, maybe applauding us, or maybe just recognizing that we're there.
Yes, that's fascinating. And there's another question, which is, to what extent was balcony life already regulated by local rules? And so surely there are things you can do and you can't do in balconies, concerned perhaps with beating carpets or putting out certain flags. And so presumably all those rules would have needed to be reconsidered during the lockdown.
Yeah, that's something, that's something I haven't actually thought about. Thank you for that, because that'll make me look into it. Yes, I don't know about flags. I've never heard of anything that has that you're not allowed to do, in the sense of putting out a particular flag or that. But also, yeah, according to who you've got under you, I don't think you're allowed to beat your carpet or water. You have to be careful with watering your geraniums so the water doesn't go onto the patio below. But I'm not sure whether those are actually regulated. They're probably regulated by I don't know, by a general law, or whether it's just the norms of each, if you live in a block of flats, by each community. And people do have like community meetings, and there's a community manager. So I imagine those things are regulated by that. But thank you, because that's something I will ask about now.
Yes, and I suppose then they get to some extent they get reinvented. So the one about noise must surely be terribly important in that context.
Yes.
Yes. But finally, for this part of the seminar, we have a question which simply says that do you intend to write this up? I think one of our readers or our listeners would love to read it.
Great. Yes, thank you. Well, thank you. That will encourage me to do so. I began to and ran out of time, but yes, I would. I think I might try. being as in August, I'm not planning to be traveling very far, not confined, but maybe staying at home. So it's probably a good opportunity. Thank you for that interest.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And now we have now we go to all three of our speakers together for the final part of our discussion. So if anybody would like to address questions relevant to all three, then please feel free to do so. But certainly I think that one could draw some kind of obvious comparisons. I mean, the social density of housing, for example, which you get in these apartment cultures. I mean, couldn't that be, in fact, just as important a variable as the ones that you've been exploring in your research? I don't know whether Patrick's here, but certainly, I don't know, what do you think about that, Barbara?
Yeah, like, well, density has been mentioned as a factor, not only by us, but by a lot of other people who tried to understand the dynamics of the spread of the virus. So definitely yes, but I think what we think is that the social dynamics are more important. So you may have people who live together, like in the huge blocks of big cities, who never meet. So that it's different than a small town in which people live perhaps not as as densely set flats. So we don't think that our model explains everything. We just found some connections, and we're trying to explore them because we think they're interesting. But I think so it's not so much about the density, but what is going on between people in these dense areas.
Yes, yes. But Tatsuma is also wondering about variation within Italy. Between, for example, Sicily and Calabria and places like that, where you've got a very strong traditional family, and yet they don't seem to have very high levels of infection, whereas in the north you do.
I saw this question and also two others that have
related.
So yes, they're related. So I will maybe answer the three of them, but we have Patrick. So I will first ask Patrick if you would like to answer the question that we had now about how we would explain the fact that in southern Italy there were not so many infections, even though this family system might be similar.
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty easy. I mean, if you go and map, I mean, it's a long way away from the centres, and people were not going down there very much. I mean, I think it's partly also to do with the localism of Italian society, but it just hasn't reached there. And the lockdown, came as, I don't think it's, the interesting question perhaps is what will happen when people, start going to beaches and all the way down there, whether in a few weeks' time we might start getting patterns like we were getting in the north. I don't know.
Yes, I mean, Giovanna's wondering whether the infection rate in northern Italy is because of its greater openness to the societies around it, a mercantile area with a very, very high level of population interchange coming in and out.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's how it got there. It doesn't explain why the highest levels of mortality are in rural towns and provincial towns, which you also get in Spain, actually, and that's one of the things we were trying to look at. Yes, certainly. I mean, I think that's why.
Yes.
And if I may go back to these two other related questions that we had. One was answered by you, Patrick, about the connection between the recovery and the community-centered societies, and the other one is about the connection between high mortality and poor medical system. So, for example, lack of ventilators in the hospitals. So we were reminded that there is a high relation between that. I have some answers on that, but I think you will also have some notes to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say. I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff about how things were mismanaged in Lombardy, and how it was due to the privatizations and the sort of neoliberal so-called reforms, which, I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but I could believe it, and the various mess-ups. I mean, we weren't sort of trying to put forward a one-line explanation, but simply to say, look, here's a model that explains some things that are surprising, and which shows that certain other things that people were blaming. I mean, I think what we're saying is don't assume that there's a problem if there's a higher level of mortality somewhere, for instance in Spain or Italy. It's because the authorities in Spain or the medical establishment in Spain or Italy have screwed up. I mean, we would think that that is perhaps an important takeaway message from what we say, is that it would be completely unjustified to think that way, because when a society is organized differently in a way that's relevant to infection, then that might be the reason. But I'm not for a minute wanting to deny that things like the lockdown or things like medical treatment save lives. They save massive numbers of lives. It's not one or the other.
If I may, only I think how I see this model is like, I think the model that Patrick presented says something about the infection rates and then which reaches mortality at some stage. So that is what we can say, and then what happens in the hospital is the other story. It might, of course, it might be that if the hospitals are better equipped, then it changes. And the question also about the relation between recovery and like close communities where people usually help each other, so also they would help each other if you get COVID. Like I really like this comment, and I would like to think more about that. So thanks to Jason, my colleague. But I think like it's also when you care for somebody who has COVID, you probably get infected. So the relation is that like it's the growth continues.
A colleague was saying to me a couple of days ago how they were talking about the Czech Republic and how people were so much better and they were caring for their old people more than in Germany. And I was thinking, yeah, it's because they don't care for their old people in Germany that old people have lived longer. You know, that is counterintuitive, and it's important to take that home. That warm, friendly communities are not what you want to protect you from this illness.
Yes, yes, yes. Which brings us into a question by Paulina, actually, where basically she's wondering whether the experience of living under communism in the socialist countries meant that people were readier to be marshaled in a crisis like this, i.e. they were more used to taking directions and living in an organized society from the top down and less atomized. Do you think that is at all a factor?
Patrick, do you want to answer this question?
Although
I would like. So I'm Polish, and it's the first time in my life where I have heard in March Polish people saying that we are disciplined. We're more disciplined than these Italian people. Like it's different. Like it's not our self-image of ourselves, and I really don't. I mean, I've heard this narrative. I think it's mad. It's just, it's similar to the narrative of Italians just being too much touchy-feely and going out together, I think. However, but like in Poland, the lockdown has been introduced very quickly. So I would just say, without any data, just like folk imagination, like that maybe it's just the fast lockdown that has helped us. But it's an interesting question to explore.
Well, all the more so, somebody from the Max Planck Institute, which is specialized in looking at the socialist countries as a discrete cultural area, and so perhaps there is something in that. If this notion is valid at all of ex-socialism, well, yeah.
One thing that you could say, which is quite interesting, is it's in the ex-communist part of Germany, where we are, that levels of infection are much lower. They're much higher, particularly in the southwest. They're higher in the ex-Catholic part. of Germany. And one of the big crisis areas in Germany early on was where they were celebrating their carnival and everyone got infected. And yeah, I mean, I think it could have a lot to do with the kinds of networks you've got. And what we haven't been talking about in Italy is the small family firms and all that networking going on, which you don't have in the East, and that could have quite a lot to do with things. I mean, I think it's also very relevant just to see, I mean, basically there was a boundary where the Iron Curtain was, although the Iron Curtain has disappeared officially. For a long, if you actually look at the maps in the Financial Times or whatever about where the little bubbles about how many people die, it just traces where the Iron Curtain was, but then that traces a whole lot of things from before then too. I mean, these are in some ways long-standing boundaries.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. But actually, taking your lead though, with regards to kinship, it would be very interesting to ask Margaret about the role of kinship in the emerging Balkany culture. Right? Are people living more or less next to each other if they're related in successive apartments, or are we talking about families being dispersed and therefore not being able to re-communicate with each other under lockdown? So did kinship play any part at all in what she observed?
I think it did, David. I think there is a tendency, I expect, although I haven't ever done any research in Italy, but I expect, and a bit like, I'm a bit wary of drawing comparisons when, you know, we might just be on the line of stereotypes, as Barbara's pointed out. But I do think there is a tendency for Basque families to live near each other. So you get also young people stay at home for much longer. So that was actually not so much a plus, but really a cause of tension sometimes, because you've got young people into their 30s, no, still living at home. So who are used to be able to come and go and go out, who aren't used to having a social life in the house, and yet they're living with their parents. So that's one issue. Then you get people, when they do set up home on their own, they tend to choose to live fairly as near as possible, sometimes in the same apartment block or in the same area. They like to live as near as possible. And also one of the issues was that a lot of grandparents look after their grandchildren. And of course, with this being seen as a risk issue for grandparents, so parents who were having to work from home found that the schools were closed, found that they'd got their children with them. They didn't want to, there was the risk of, they didn't want to take them to their grandparents. And so this kind of linking in with the family with common care networks was an issue. But it was also kind of, the other point is that people here do like to get together. They do have big family gatherings, family meals. And so this was one thing that people found it hard to understand, that they couldn't, you know, well, okay, we understand that social life has to stop, but surely the family, we should still be able to see the family, you know, and visit family. And even some of the older people found it difficult to understand that they couldn't, you know, just because they were family. And somebody the other day said to me, it's like a misunderstanding of what it is in Spanish. You say tener confianza, which would be like to have confidence, but also in the sense of being familiar with, of familiarity. Or so you understand that if people who you have confianza with must be safe because you know them. So your family, you know, you tend to think they're safe. They can't be risky for me in a health situation because es gente de confianza, no, it's people that I trust, that I know. Whereas in fact it's, so it's kind of like a misunderstanding in that sense, a misreading of what a relationship should protect you, but where it could actually be a risk.
It's also very, very difficult to refuse a request by kin in this in some societies. The fact that it comes from a brother or a cousin means you, if you deny them the possibility of meeting, they could take it very personally indeed. And so you're enmeshed in a very, very strong family kinship, mutual expectation zone, if you like, which when something comes from outside, is quite difficult to break free from.
Yes. Yes, I think you're right. And that was even, I remember just before we went into lockdown, that week before, and we were supposed to be having a family meal, and we said, do you think this is wise? They're starting to say that we should cut down social relationships. And it took it was something that we felt kind of really antisocial saying it, and it wasn't well received.
Indeed.
Without,
but please go ahead.
No, so I just wanted to add another aspect of that. So it might be an understanding of what is safe. It might be this like social understanding of what is insult or not. In my case, as I was looking, I spent the confinement with my aging parents, but also in a village in Poland where a lot of elderly people live alone. And the moment when they had opportunity to meet with their children, they wanted to, and what they said was, I don't care, like I don't, like it's perhaps it's the last stage of my life, so I really want to meet my granddaughter or the son. So I think there are a lot of factors to explore.
Could you just clarify, Margaret, did virtual media not act as a surrogate for kinship?
That's another good, excellent question, isn't it? Did it act? I think it did in some cases, but not all older people are technology friendly, although in my case with my parents-in-law are incredibly good, but in fact my mom in Bristol is not at all good with that, so I think it just depends on people. And I don't think people felt it was the same or feel it's the same. No, there's this big issue of hugging, of not being able to hug, not being able to touch, the whole body language as well. No, body language or body communication, no, bodily communication. So I think it's perhaps a temporary substitute, but not one that all people either warm to. And another thing was interesting with this speaking, like now we're kind of observing our turns to speak, but in this society people tend to speak over one another. They don't find it as easy just to respect each person's turn to speak. So I found if I connected with when we had family discussions, it was really difficult to manage, and nobody wanted to manage it because that would be to impose order. But so this is a whole, I don't think it's necessarily linked to kinship, it's more linked to communication practices. I don't know what you two think.
Well, I would ask, is there a strong ideology of egalitarianism as between houses in Basque country? I'm thinking about that. I mean, is there a strong sort of anti-hierarchical feeling? The reason I'm asking is this is very, very, what you're saying is very, very familiar to me from where I did my fieldwork in the sort of far northeast of Italy. It sounds very, very similar. And I mean, I remember one local council meeting in our village where no one wanted to be seen to make a choice because you mustn't divide the village, and there had to be 2 electoral lists. And in the end, it was decided that they would be drawn by lots, and the lots would be picked by the anthropologist, so that no one in the community had imposed anything on anyone else. And yet, at another level, they're really quite heavy. You have to do what you're meant to do. So it's quite a paradoxical sort of thing.
Yes, that's brilliant. Patrick, I think you're absolutely right. There is a big egalitarian kind of ideology that goes back a long way. In fact, compared with British society, this is like not at all a class society, although of course there are socioeconomic differences. But there isn't the same kind of class consciousness. And yes, it's also something I think that's exacerbated in the Basque country because they tend to be people who don't like to stand out, who don't like to draw attention to themselves. They're very kind of modest. And I think that's one of the issues with the performance interviews that I've read, where they've interviewed, the press have interviewed musicians, and they say, oh, it was just like so embarrassing at the beginning, but, you know, standing out and playing my instrument, even musicians who are performers, no? So I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it also links into something with, particularly in Spain, because of the dictatorship through the greater part of the 20th century, because the idea that something should be imposed on you makes everybody think back to Franco and people being dictated to. So I think that's another issue here, is that you don't like to be dictated to, or you don't want to dictate or be seen to be dictating to anyone. And I think that's one of the things with here. It works if there's fines, people function. But just this lunchtime, after on the daily news, people are saying, oh, what do you think about having to wear the masks again? Say, well, you know, we're not doing it. We know we should, but we don't. But if it's going to be enforced, we will.
That's sadly a good note to stop on. I'm afraid it's an absolutely fascinating seminar. So thank you so much for our speakers today, for really taking us into areas that we didn't know about, and we always learn so much from them. So, well, what can I say is, please, everyone there, if you're not already a fellow of the RAI, do consider joining us. We're open to everybody. We can only continue functioning and having wonderful events like this if people do join us. I mean, we get no government grant at all. So please do consider becoming a fellow of the RAI. And we really just have to say, well, once more, thank you to our speakers, and it's goodbye from us at the RAI. So,
very, very, very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
See you again
everybody.
next week.